Okay, I see there's quite a lot of you now, so I think we can get started. So hello everyone and welcome to this masterclass on how to demonstrate legal skills through work experience with BPP University. We've got some excellent speakers today and a lot to get through, so we hope that you enjoy this masterclass and find the session valuable. So we always start our masterclasses with our learning outcomes. So by the end of this masterclass, you should understand how to identify and extract illegal and transferable skills from, work experience. Um, Learn how to articulate your experiences clearly and confidently in applications and in interviews. Gain insight into what law firms and chambers look for when assessing skill-based evidence, and feel more confident just in general to speak about your work experience. I'll pass on to our speakers so we can get the session really started. So yeah, Comfort, onto you.
Thank you. I'm just going to share the slides and we'll get started.
Yeah, that looks all good.
Perfect. Well, thank you everyone for joining today's session. My name is Comfort Asaolu. I'm one of the career development consultants here at BPP and I'm based in the Midlands. It's fantastic to see so many of you here this afternoon and thank you for coming at this time. Hopefully today's session will be slightly interactive, but also informative in the sense that you would leave with some sort of reassurance on how to reframe your work experience better in applications. So today I'm also joined by one of our amazing student ambassadors, Rebecca, who you will hear from later on as well. And yeah, if you have any questions as we go through the slides, feel free to just put your question in the chat and then we'll go through them at the end. Okay. So when it comes to today's topic, it's one of the things that I hear a lot and it's something that can often cause anxiety for applicants. So whether your background is in, retail, care, admin, legal background, or even, you're just transitioning to university, hopefully there'll be something in today's session for everybody. The ultimate goal is that by the end of the session, you'll be able to draft stronger, competency aligned evidence for your applications and interviews. So before we get started and looking at the learning objectives, I just want to get a sense of your work experiences so far. So if you can, just put in the chat where most of your work experience come from up to date. So whether that is legal work that you have or non-legal, if you've got a combination of both or neither, it would just be good to get a sense of where everyone is at the moment. I'll give you about a minute to do that and then we'll go through the rest of the presentation. Okay, just gonna have a look and see. Okay, so I can see there's a lot of non-legal as well as combination. So that's very, yeah, that's interesting. So we'll come on to, how you can reference your experiences, both legal and non-legal. And for those of you that might not have any, we'll be able to discuss opportunities for you to build those experiences as well. Great, thank you. So what are we going to cover today? Hopefully by the end of the session, you will be able to identify what the key competencies are that employers are looking for, recognize those transferable skills from both legal and non-legal experience, and also understand how to structure your work experience examples effectively in applications, as well as to avoid common mistakes that we often see. And hopefully by the end, you'll be able to you will leave the session with a simple framework that you can use to strengthen your future applications. Sorry, 1 second, my screen is just frozen. Okay. So before you start thinking about your applications and drafting your answers, one of the first things to do is to really start by researching the firms. So firstly, you also want to understand, your motivation. There's no point in just, having a scattergun approach and just applying for any and every firm or chamber. You really need to understand what your career ambitions are and what motivates you. So when you're thinking about, why do you want to be a lawyer? Think back to where that interest first started. It might have been something it might have been something recently, or it might have been something from a while back. So think about what it is that really motivates you or attracted you to the law in itself. So that alone would not be enough. You then want to say what actions you've taken to reinforce that interest. So whether that is the legal work experiences that you've tried to secure, it might be events that you've attended, or people that you've spoken to through maybe insight days or open days. So the goal here is to think about what you've learned from those conversations and what you find most motivating. And then once you've done that research, you then want to show that you understand the role itself. So you understand the job of what the role of a solicitor is, or barrister, for instance, and you understand, the type of clients that they work with. You understand what the problems and the challenges are that you'll be solving, and the value that you would essentially have on your clients and in the workplace. So thinking about, the research on the firm, is very important, because often the time you get asked the questions, why have you applied to this set, or why have you applied to this firm? So when you've done the research and you understand, the reputation, you understand the size of the firm, the location, the practice areas, the matters that they work on, and you also understand what is important to you. So for instance, you might be someone who values that work-life balance. So making sure that, all of that goes into your research, and it goes into helping you narrow down the right firms and the right chambers for you. In terms of the research, there are several, resources available to you. So in addition to the firm's website, you want to be using websites like lawcareers.net, for instance, Legal 500, Chambers of Partners, and the Chambers Student Guide as well, and several others. You also want to develop your commercial awareness, so keeping up to date with what's going on in the news as well. And then in terms of application deadlines. So the key here is to really start as early as possible. So you want to give yourself enough time to do that research, and you want to make sure that you have a structured approach to drafting your applications in order to avoid, getting burnt out. So here are some of the deadlines that you'll find for some of the typical legal schemes that you might apply for. So let's start off with what firms and chambers are actually looking for. So when they're assessing your application, they're not really asking, oh, has this person worked in a law firm before? What they're asking instead is, does this person demonstrate the competencies required to succeed in a legal role? And one thing you'll find across, law firms and chambers is that whilst the wording might vary slightly, the competencies that they're requiring remains highly consistent. So some of the skill from conversations with them and looking at various job descriptions and applications, a lot of the top skills that you're looking for um, are the following. So communication, your teamwork, organizational skills, attention to detail. And these skills will be assessed at the application stage all the way through to interview stage. And also whilst you're doing, so if you've applied for a training contract or vacation scheme, for example, those competencies will also be assessed throughout your vacation schemes or your training contract. So in addition to these soft interpersonal skills, they're also looking for evidence of your commercial awareness as well as your resilience. So don't be afraid to highlight any, tough experiences or challenges that you faced, and then thinking about how you adapted to those scenarios. And in terms of like legal tasks that they value, so some of these would include, your drafting, your research, client interviewing, but also your advocacy skills for a barrister role. So things like, preparing bundles, attending courts, or even interviewing clients. Sometimes they might come across as quite basic because you're not actively doing stuff, you're mainly observing. but these are highly valuable to recruiters because the key there, the evidence that they want to see is, how you contributed and what you learn from those work experiences. So one thing I want to tell you is that your job is not really to impress them by saying, "Oh, I've worked in this area, I've worked in this law firm." Your role and your job is simply to show them how you think and how you act. Okay. So based on the competencies on this slide, I just want you to have a think and from the poll that you did earlier, which competency do you often find the hardest to evidence on your application? So if you have a think about it and just put your answers in the chat, we'll go through them at the end and see, which ways you can better evidence those competencies. Okay. So before we start looking at the frameworks that you can use to help you draft stronger applications, I just want to debunk some common myths that I often hear from students. So the most common one is I don't have enough legal experience. I also hear, oh, I think you need a vacation scheme to show, legal skill, or you need a mini pupillage. And also, a lot of the time we hear, oh, retail or hospitality role isn't relevant. I'm here to tell you that that's simply not the case. So again, they're not really counting the number of, legal work that you've done on your CV. They're looking for evidence of your potential. So essentially, they're evaluating your motivation, how you think, how you reflect, and how you develop. So one thing you'll find is that sometimes, in some cases, maybe two candidates, they would have the same identical experiences, and then one of them would get an interview whilst the other doesn't get an interview. And you'll be asking, oh, why is that? The difference is pretty much, in how the experience was articulated in the application. So I want you to think, whatever you're doing right now, whether that is a cafe role or retail role, admin, office admin, even, care work or pro bono volunteering work, all of these experiences can be valuable. If you have a customer facing role, for instance, this is a fantastic experience that can showcase excellent transferable skills like, customer service. And again, customers can, ultimately translate to clients. So whatever the experience you have, what I want you to think is, I want you to ask yourself the following question: what skill am I using in this role? Or what skills have I demonstrated? And then think about, what challenges you've overcome, and then how that sort of links to what, the skills and the qualities that law firms and chambers are looking for. Okay. So on the slide, I've put common legal and non-legal work experience, and I've put them side by side just to show you that both of these experiences, they can pretty much generate almost the same quality of evidence that you can use for your applications, because ultimately you want to be describing the behaviors and the results that you achieve in the role. So if you look at the legal side, for instance, if you've done a mini pupillage or you've done a vacation scheme, you can typically evidence observation, analysis, by asking yourself, what did you notice? What did you notice on the experience? What notes did you take? How did, overall experience, how did it sharpen your reasoning skill? So for a vocation scheme, for instance, you're looking at, teamwork, organizational skills by meeting certain deadlines, juggling different tasks, and you might have given a fantastic idea that was then implemented. So all of these things can show you, client communication. It can show you can demonstrate attention to detail, drafting or research skills through them. Okay, and these are from the legal perspective. If we flip over to the non-legal side, you've got, retail, hospitality, volunteering, or even sports or society team. So you can ultimately express and evidence the same skills here. So thinking about, for instance, a scenario where you were able to calm a distressed customer, or you're able to overturn a complaint that a customer displayed, or how you prioritized you prioritize maybe queues or you prioritize activities to do. All of these things shows your client communication skills as well as your organization skills. So if you've worked as part of a sports team, for instance, you can show your leadership skills through that, your resilience, being able to like, collaborate with other people and coordinate. So again, all of these things are equally valuable and transferable in a legal context. For some of you, you might have volunteering experience, and this would often show you demonstrating number one initiative, but also, adapting and taking initiative as well as, understanding certain frameworks and ethical things that you need to be aware of. Okay, so when you're thinking about your experiences and you're taking stock of what you've done, think about it from the context of the skill rather than the role itself. Okay, so ask yourself, okay, what skill can I demonstrate through this experience, and then link that to legal work. Okay. So ultimately, the question shouldn't really be, is this experience, is it legal enough? Instead, you want to start asking yourself, what behavior, what competence does this demonstrate? So one thing I'll highly recommend that you start doing if you haven't already heard of this is something called transferable skill matrix. You can also call it a skills audit. This is where you create a document and no one else has to see the document apart from yourself. So you're basically detailing your work experience in the document on one in one column, and then the other column you're going to detail the behavior, so what you did in the role, and then you also want to have outcomes and the skill or the competence that you are demonstrating through that. So I highly recommend that you create one of these documents. It can be, as long and as detailed as you want it to be. So start off by thinking about your task or what were you trying to solve, what were you trying to achieve, and then think of, your behaviors, what you did specifically. Then you think about the outcome. So what changed as a result of your actions? And then finally, the skill, the competency that it shows. And this can apply to both legal, non-legal work experience. Okay. And what you find that by doing this, skills audio or transferable skill matrix, you realize that you actually have a lot more to say than you think you do. And then it's easier for you to draft those application answers when they ask you, can you describe when you've done this? If they ask you those competency-based questions, tell me about a time you've done or you've demonstrated this skill. It'll be easier for you to look back on your documents and then find the right appropriate example to use. So let's have a look at a typical trainee or pupil profile. So based on everything that we've covered so far, I want you to have a think about where you think some of the skills that would typically be required, where do you think these skills could have been developed outside of a legal setting? So I'll give you about 30 seconds or so to have a think. And then if you put some maybe job titles or examples in the chat, we can go through some of them. So think about each of these skills and think, okay, which roles can best demonstrate them outside of a legal setting? Okay, so I can see a few answers in the chat so far. So we've got care assistant, shop assistant, retail, journalist, yep, customer service. Someone said KP. I'm not sure what KP means. Um, problem solved. Yep, good. Medical, that's an interest medical assessor. Yeah, very good. So these are all fantastic options. HR, yep. Manager, teacher, yep. Fantastic. So what you see is that there's a range of different job titles or job descriptions that will still translate to legal work, and you can all these skills are transferable skills that you can gain from any role. So if you look at teamwork, for example, a lot of you will already have strong evidence of teamwork without even realizing it. So, like some of you mentioned, you mentioned retail, hospitality, even being a part of a sports team, or organizing events with or student society. All of these things show that you can collaborate, you can coordinate tasks, you can support other people just as you would if you're a trainee or people. Communication skills, that is very, that can come from any customer facing role, really. So even as a medical assessor, like someone suggested, dealing with, patients, dealing with tough clients, or tough customers, handling queries, dealing with complaints, even things like, being a tutor, mentoring jobs, or even working as a student ambassador. These all these roles would demonstrate, clear, adaptable, written, and verbal communication skills, which you can then translate to legal practice. And then problem solving, this is one of the skills that a lot of employers, they really seek evidence of, and sometimes it's often one where students fall short of. But what you can do with problem solving, you can find this role, you can find evidence of problem solving in typical fast-paced role. So for example, think of an example where you had to adapt quickly during a busy shift, or you had to maybe troubleshoot a technical problem in an IT role, or even when you had to like plan events or manage unexpected challenges. All of these things would count as problem solving evidence. And then similarly with like attention to detail as well, if you've worked as an editor of a newsletter, for instance, or you're in an admin role, all of these things can show, how you handle them in a sensitive way. All of these everyday responsibilities can then translate into the legal competencies that are required. So the main takeaway from this slide and from what we've discussed so far is that you don't necessarily need a long list of legal internships or legal experience to highlight that you've got the right legal competencies. Most of these skills are built into everyday roles that you're doing. So don't let the type of work experience that you have pull you off in really highlighting that you're a suitable candidate. Okay. Now, let's move on to the more interesting part in terms of how to evidence um, your skills effectively. So when it comes to your CV, writing a cover letter or even answering application questions, often the time you come across questions which ask you to demonstrate that you've got the competencies that the employer is looking for, or when they're asking you about your motivation or your experience in a particular area. The best way to structure your answers and to ensure that you effectively progress to the interview stage is to use a framework called the STAR technique. So, STAR, a lot of you might have come across this already, stands for situation, task, action, result. And I like to add an extra letter there, which stands for learning. And ideally, you want the learning itself is what separates your answer from being, okay and competent to being really, really compelling. So try not to miss the learning or the reflection at the end of your answer. So ideally, you want to start off with a brief context, a brief introduction on what the situation is without giving unnecessary detail. So this helps the recruiter, the person reading your answer, to understand the challenge, and then you go on to the task where you define the responsibility that you are given or what you're trying to, excuse me, trying to achieve in that situation. And then what you want to make sure to do is the bulk of your answer has to come from the action. Okay, so this should be the majority where you explain the steps that you took personally to solve the issue, to communicate better, and then overall, and ultimately, what was the impact? What was the result? So what happened at the end? What did you achieve? And then what did you learn from that experience? And where possible, link it back to the job that you're applying for, link it back to the firm. In order to make your answer even more compelling, you want to make sure that you're using strong, active verbs when you're describing your actions. And you're not necessarily saying, "Oh, we did this," or just being very vague, but you're really giving them a practical um, step-by-step understanding of the steps and the rationale that you took to make that decision. So, for example, instead of you saying, "Oh, whilst trying to make a decision, we decided to reorganize the workflow," instead you can say something like, "Oh, I proposed." So you're changing "we" to "I" and say, "I proposed and implemented a new task rotation system after identifying, some of the issues during peak hours." So that shows, it shows structure and it shows specific things and action steps that you took. And then, like I said, with the results, is thinking about what happened in the end and where possible, try and quantify it. So if you maybe reduce processing time, you prevented an error, you got positive customer feedback, whatever it is that you can quantify that impact that you had in the role, that would be highly relevant. And then the key there is to then, think about your learning experience, so linking it back to the job, what you learned overall, reflecting on the experience overall. If something didn't go so well, address that, this is what I would do differently next time. And then again, link it back to law. Why is it relevant? Why does a lawyer need to have that particular skill? Okay. So that's the structure and the framework that we recommend. And we'll just have a look at an example. So the question says, describe a time you demonstrated problem-solving skills. A typical answer might say, "Oh, I worked in a cafe where there was often miscommunication between the kitchen and front of our staff. To improve this, I helped, improve communication and things ran more smoothly." That answer is quite short, number one, and is also quite vague. What you see is that if it lacks, the impact, it also lacks ownership because you're thinking, "Oh, how did you help? How did you improve the communications? And what did you mean by things ran more smoothly?" So it's not as doesn't have much depth. However, if you apply the STAR technique, you'll get something that shows the situation and the task very briefly, and then the action. So you can see instead of saying, "I helped improve communication," the student have said, "I proposed implementing a written order verification system, and I briefed pre-shift coordination meetings, and then the result of that." So what happened, less errors, and then they've gone one step further to explain what they learned from the experience. So the experience strengthened their ability to identify these issues, and then they've linked it to the firm as well. So the second answer is highly specific. It shows the process. It also shows them taking initiative, and then it links it back to legal work. Even the second answer can still be improved further. So they could expand on the action bit a little bit more, add of maybe two more sentences there, and then again say what they might do differently next time. Okay, let's have another example. So this question is around teamwork. So tell me about a time you've worked as part of a team. Again, going through this using the STAR technique. So you start off with your situation. So this example is coming from, maybe secondary school, college experience, or whilst at school, or at university, I was part of the netball team. We needed to raise funds to buy more equipment for the team. Very, very brief. Then they go into their tasks. So one of the main tasks was to work as part of a team and to set up a big sale to raise more money. And then the action that they took, followed by the results. So if you're looking at this example, you might be asking, is this a strong or, a weak answer? And my answer to that question that you might be asking is that it's again, it's not the strongest example, but it's a good answer because it's showing you ultimately what they did. So the task. So you can see here that this person is saying so I took the lead, so showing their leadership skill. I held meetings. I made sure that we were all clear on our roles. So specific things and steps and strategies that they took. And then again, they've got the result there at the end. The only thing would be, in terms of improvement, would be to again link it back to, how they would apply it in a legal role if they were applying for a trainee role, for instance. How would they work as part of a team, or why is it important as a trainee to be collaborative? So that could take it one step further. So this Star technique is really useful for, as I mentioned, for application questions. You can also use it for interview at the interview stage as well to answer any competency-based questions that you might be asked. So how should you evidence your skills and your experiences on your CV? So let's have a look at some example. So with the CV, similar to the STAR technique, in some contexts, some people call it CAR, so context, action, result. And often the time they say, CAR is ideal for CVs, whereas STAR can be for longer answers. So when you're drafting your bullet points for your CV, you want to avoid saying something like, "Oh, I was responsible for handling, customer queries or customer complaints." That's a weak answer because number one, it doesn't really show, what you did specifically. Instead, you want to start your CV with active verbs. So you want to start with a strong action verb, which will provide the context, and then you want to end with a tangible result or impact that you had in the role. So, for example, instead of saying, responsible for customer service, you would say resolved customer complaints during peak hours, excuse me, by implementing a rapid triage system, which reduced queue times by 30%, and therefore improved satisfaction scores. Or you can say, you achieved a personal top service recognition. So that slight change in the phrase in the phrasing that you're using really demonstrate number one ownership, also demonstrate the initiative that you took, as well as quantifiable achievement. So the goal on your CV is to make it as achievement focused as possible, okay? So starting off with what you did, how you did it, and then the impact of that in the role. So I've put some additional examples on the slide as well. So if, for instance, you worked as a treasurer as part of a student society, and you want to demonstrate maybe your attention to detail or your communication skill, you can have a bullet point that says, start off with the active verb, manage, a specific budget, and then what was the outcome of that? Similarly, for customer support role, again, demonstrating your communication or problem solving skills, you will start off by saying, you resolved client complaint, um, proposing a solution, and then cutting the escalation rate over a period of time. And then for healthcare, again, if you're, working as a support worker, you can demonstrate your resilience, your attention to detail, and client service skills by using an example like that. Okay. So this is how you would evidence your work experience effectively on your CV, as well as your application answers that we've covered. So I'm now just to wrap up, I'm just going to go through some common mistakes that we often see and how to best, fix and avoid those mistakes. So the first thing that we often see is number one, just stating, the role that you did, describing the role rather than the skills and the achievements. So you want to make sure that you're focusing on your achievements, mainly on your CV, but also when you're drafting your answer, you want to emphasize the impact that you had in the role. Another mistake would be, using I rather than using we rather than saying I did something if it's a team example. So make sure that you use, personal contributions. So clarify your own individual contribution and the actions that you took. Another error is being quite vague and not quantifying the results. So again, if you can, some work experiences you can't necessarily quantify to an exact number. So in those cases, you can estimate or you can give um rather than having quantified, we can have qualitative impact instead. So whether that is reducing error rates or improving turnaround time. So really try as much as possible to quantify your achievement. And then misalignment with competencies or really just copy and pasting the same answers across different law firms. You want to make sure that each application answer fits in with the law firm itself. So you've done the research, you've tailored it effectively to, their culture, their values, and you're pretty much answering the right question and you're not just copying across. and making sure that your examples match carefully to the competency frameworks like the SRA or BSB have established. And then finally, another mistake we often see is lack of reflection and ignoring, non-legal experiences as well. So again, what is key here is evidence of a growth mindset and continual learning. So as you're doing your work experiences, whatever role you get, try and keep an achievement log, try and keep a portfolio of what you're learning, mistakes, and how you adapt into those things. Reflection is very, very important, and being able to evidence that really well on your application is key. Okay. So I hope these examples that we've gone through has been quite helpful in showing you how to take, your application answers from a weak suggestion to a stronger example, and also how you can tweak the phrasing and the language, how you can tweak that to make sure that it's as active, it's as impactful and achievement focused as possible. Okay. So I've given you the framework in theory, and I've given you some example. I think it would be nice to actually hear from someone who's been through the process. They can talk about their experience. So I'm very pleased to introduce you to our student ambassador, Rebecca. We'll go through her slides and her experiences with you.
You comfort. So yeah, as you said, I'm Rebecca. I am a future trainee at Pennington's Manchester Cooper. Right now, I am studying at BPP University. I'm doing my LLM SQE 1 and 2 to hopefully get the masters and get the SQE done before I start my training contract. So yeah, I was asked to speak today just to provide some insight into my experiences, give you some real life context, and discuss kind of the law firms that I found law firms seek, the competencies that law firms seek. So, just a bit of background about myself. I entered the application cycle in my final year of university. I had looked at doing so previously. It just wasn't sure when I wanted to start, wasn't sure how long my degree was going to be. Ended up doing a study abroad year in there somewhere. So, it wasn't until my final year where I was really able to buckle down and focus on the application cycle. Unfortunately, I was successful. I received a few offers at the end of that stage. So, I have experience being assessed in a variety of different ways and through different firms procedures, but I did find within all of that there was reoccurring themes. So I thought it would kind of be useful today for me to discuss some of those with you and what I found to be most useful in my prep in relation to skills and competencies. And just to kind of disclaim before I get too far into that, I had basically all non-legal work experience when I was going into this application cycle. So the only legal work experience I had was whilst I was at university. I was given a pro bono opportunity. So I did some volunteering at the local Citizens Advice Centre. I helped with their welfare and appeals tribunals clinic. But that was only a short period of training and then 2 days actually helping clients. So whilst great and really useful, was not comprehensive enough in itself to carry me through this process. So most of my experience came from the things we've discussed today, things like retail, working in a cafe, so brand manager, events, camp counselor, careers secretary for a school society. I did some student research and some tutoring work, that kind of stuff. And those, the skills I learned from those jobs is what I took into me and what led me to be successful in these interviews. So hopefully that can also provide some reassurance if you're someone that doesn't have a lot of legal work experience, because it's useful, but it's definitely not necessary. Um, as long as you can kind of show how your skills are relevant and transferable. So, as I say, I went through a variety of different types of firms processes and competency interviews, but I picked up on the recurring themes. So, I thought it'd be useful to discuss what I thought firms wanted going in versus what I found they actually wanted as I came out. So, I've listed a few on the slide. First one being complete legal literacy. So I remember when I was going into these interviews, I did a law degree, so I was studying my law degree notes. I was going over, the key principles of contract law, land law, tort law, anything that I thought might come up. I was researching the areas of law that the firm covered, and I was trying to figure out the key, most contentious points of law in those areas. And that wasn't entirely unuseful. Of course, I did get some case studies on the law, but what I will say is going into these interviews, you've already met the grade requirements for this job. They would have stated them on the form when you applied. You would have met them. The very fact that you get a competency interview shows that they are confident in your academics and where you're at. So, of course, they care about your academics and your law knowledge, but it's not necessarily their primary concern when it comes to an interview. Also, either you will have already done the SQE or some sort of solicitor's exam, if you're going through the solicitor route, or the same for the bar, or you will do it after receiving the interview. And those courses and those exams prepare you to have the skills and knowledge that you need to do that job. So, yes, they care, but their priority is more on how you can present yourself as an asset, and how you can show that you have a desire to continue learning, show that you're adaptable, you have a desire to progress, that they think you'll be successful in growing your knowledge and committing to growing your knowledge, after they hire you and throughout your work at that firm. So I found things like extracurriculars were great for this, showing that you took initiative, you went above and beyond. Anything you can do to kind of demonstrate that you don't just know the bare minimum, you haven't just met the academic requirements, but you've pushed yourself further. Law firms receive that really well because that's the kind of people they want. They don't want someone that can be the bare minimum. They want someone who is going to be an asset to them, someone who's curious. Maybe you thought you liked something, so you tried it out in this way, and then to further your skill, you did this, and now you know this. That kind of showing of a growth mindset is really, I think, more key than just being able to list off a load of laws that you know that anyone who eventually studies the SQE or did the law degree should possibly also know. That's more of the focus in these interviews I found. So the other thing that I thought firms wanted was my most successful moments. And of course they do. They want to hear about your most successful moments. But in interviews, I was going into it thinking, what is the best thing I ever did at work? What was my, best contribution? How can I really shine and tell them all the amazing things I've done? How can I fit in every single bit of work experience I think is relevant? They definitely want to hear about things they've done. This is an opportunity for you to say yourself. Of course, keep those things in mind. But something that caught me off guard a little bit when I went into all of these interviews is when they were talking to me about my skills and competencies, they actually very rarely asked, when did something go well for you? When did you really excel in this skill? They tend to ask more of a question of, when did something go wrong? How did you grow? And what did you learn from that? Because when you get into the legal profession, it's high pressure, it's unpredictable, things aren't going to go well all the time. So what they really care about is someone who can develop through setbacks and show resilience. They can show that they're dependent, they can show growth. So when you're going into these interviews, of course, yes, prep your best work experience, but if you can prep for, say, one of the traditional skills like attention to detail, or when is a time where maybe you or someone in your team didn't show attention to detail, how did you learn from that and grow? They may ask you about those kind of challenges. When did you work well in a team, but someone was being really difficult? How did you overcome that stress? When was you trying to do something at work, but someone wasn't allowing you to do so? And how did you develop through that? If you can think of examples that show the traditional skills, but perhaps in a way where it didn't go perfectly, but it was your efforts and your approach that fixed it, I think that would pay off really well. Giving my experience of interviews, that does seem to be a core kind of skill there. So the next thing I wrote down was having a law-oriented personality. I thought firms wanted me to be obsessed with the law. They do want you to have an interest in it. Obviously, they'll ask you why law, why this firm. They'll encourage you to tell them about commercial awareness and things like that. Yes, it's good to know the law, but the interviewers are possibly going to be your colleagues. And lawyers are people that are going to interact with clients. So what they're really seeking in this is how well of a fit you are with other people. Are you relatable? Can you empathize with people? And part of that is having other skills. A lot of times I've been in an interview and something we've talked about might be our favorite sports teams and something like that. And it's good to build rapport with the interviewer who may be your colleague, or if you have a client even. It's a great way to build rapport if you can be relatable in that way. So if you have hobbies and interests outside of the law, it's also really good to keep that in mind. I found that on a lot of my application forms, often there will be a question about hobby. Write 250 words about something that you enjoy doing. This doesn't have to be a legal thing, and I think this is possibly a bit of a myth going into interviews, is everything you say has to be legally focused. As I say, they want to see someone that's relatable, good with clients, good as a colleague. So if you have any hobbies that you think you might find interesting, I'd say keep those in mind and don't feel like you have to automatically default to a law skill or a law hobby, a law interest. when you have something that you're possibly quite passionate about and could talk better about. Because also, if they ask you a question back, if they bounce back on you about something, you need to be able to answer it. So if you answer a question about a legal experience you've had that, for example, in my instance, where it was only 2 days, I'd actually be much better talking about a hobby that I did outside, where I developed a skill through that hobby, because I could reply to that and have much more to say and further that discussion and build a good rapport with the interviewer than I could about using experience I don't know much about. And actually, I found that I was pretty much always asked about my hobbies in interviews as well. So having a well-roundedness, having other interests, knowing that you don't need to be law all the time, I'd say is also a really good thing to bear in mind going into these interviews. So the final thing I wrote down in terms of what I thought firms wanted was a desire to become a partner, or at least some kind of desire to show progression up the ranks really quickly. And I remember I went into an interview once and they said, where do you want to be? How do you want to progress to this firm? I was like, oh, well, in 10 years or whatever, or 20 years, I want to be a partner. I want to be the best I can be and get to the highest role I can be. And they asked me why. I said, oh, I don't know. I guess I like the responsibility. I would like to be a leader. They said, well, couldn't you be that by being a mentor? Or couldn't you do this in other ways? And it really makes you think that when a firm asks you about where you want to be in 5 or 10 years, they're not necessarily looking for the straightforward answer or the one that might be the default that comes to your brain. That could be your goal, and if so, great, but you kind of need to justify that. What growth do you want? What are your personal career aspirations? So maybe your goal is to add value to the team, to be someone that can be the go-to expert in that area. And I think that's something that you find when you think about, previous jobs you had. Were you necessarily interested in getting promotions, or were you more interested in becoming an expert in your area, becoming an asset? You can use your previous experiences to influence your wants and your goals. And having a good idea of yourself going into these interviews is a really good way, I'd say, to approach it, because they are going to ask you what you want, and you need to be able to give them a clear answer on that. So hopefully that's kind of given you a little bit of an insight into what I found with what firms wanted, and how you can present that. If you don't mind moving on, I've got one more slide really quickly just to give you some takeaways before I wrap it up today. I thought I'd leave you with a little bit of my do's and don'ts, what I think went well for me and what I wouldn't do again, if I was to be in your situation going forward to jobs in relation to skills and competencies. So as Comfort was talking about with the STAR method, I would say have a skill bank prepared. This obviously seems quite a straightforward one, but it's a key one. They're going to ask you about core competencies, core skills, the general skills that we've gone over in today's session. Have a skill bank prepared. Think about your best example for that, like what job you're doing at the time when you had that, and apply the STAR method to that. And it should become more of a default to you when you're asked these questions on the spot. You always have a go-to answer, or at least if it's a question you're slightly unsure about, you kind of can relate your experiences because you have that in the back of your mind going strong. And that being said, include examples where you made errors or faced a setback that wasn't your fault. So let's say if you're working in a team, someone wasn't being cooperative, what did you do to get over that? How did you communicate? How was it your role that improved the situation? So think about times that things weren't perfect, because that is what law firms care about. The fact that you can problem solve in that way is really important. Another just kind of tip on that one is if you are struggling to work out how your experiences relate, like I know some of you, I saw talking in the chat, oh, I've only really had like a cafe experience. Everyone else has had that kind of experience. How do I relate to that? Well, look at the firm's values, look at the firm's job description. They normally give you a pretty good idea of what it is they're looking for. If you notice that one of their biggest values is teamwork, then straight away the first thing I'd be doing is going into my experiences and thinking, well, what's the best example I've had of teamwork, whether that's in a legal role or a non-legal role. They care that you can demonstrate the skill, and they'll normally give you a good framework of what to know there. So that's my do's, my don'ts. Something that I did all the time. You can forget that law firms are businesses. I would often go into this being, well, why do you want law? Well, I love helping people. I want to help people. And I had evidence of when I'd done that before, and I'm going in there and saying all of this good stuff. But a firm is a service provider. At the end of the day, they want to know how you can add value to them. So when you're thinking about your experiences and what skills might be transferable, think about, if I was hiring someone, how would I see their skills as valuable to me? what asset can they provide to me? How are they going to help me and my firm to be successful? And that might provide a bit of guidance on what kind of things you need to be talking about in those interviews. Another thing I would do is don't exaggerate previous experiences. I think this is something that I found tends to happen when you say maybe you don't have legal work experience. Like for me, I really wanted to talk about the 2 days of pro bono experience I did because I felt like that was my only legal skill. I thought I have to get a legal skill in there somewhere. But again, if I mention that and they ask me questions about it, there's very little I can say. And at the end of the day, they're looking for your skills. So if you have a particularly strong experience, use it, and be prepared for follow-up questions. Be prepared to talk through what went on, and as much as you can, build up a bank of experiences and skills that are default. You can say them off the bat, that are truthful and that you don't need to make up on the spot, because that will help you to sail through an interview with less mistakes along the way. And my final point is just don't forget legal ethics or professionalism. This is a really straightforward thing and something that I think a lot of people, going into these interviews will know. You need to be professional and present yourself well. But I always like to think of it in relation to my work experience. So, for example, when I was a server, how was I taught to approach customers and what did I do if I didn't know the answer to one of their questions? If a customer came up to me and said, "Oh, do you know about this allergy?" say, for example, and I didn't know, you don't just go, "Well, no, I don't know, sorry," and leave them. You're there to help. You say, "I don't know, but this is how I could find out," and something like that. So I think when you can view that kind of professionalism from your other work experiences, you'll find that you're already quite set up. You know how to present yourself in interviews, you know how to do this role, you have the skills ready. If you can translate what you've learned and how you've behaved in previous jobs, you will be fine in these kind of experiences. So I'll leave you there, but just, yeah, your work experience will be transferable, whether legal or non-legal. So just spend some time thinking through how. And that's it for me.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and thank you, Comfort, as well. Lots of useful examples and things to take away. I think we have a few minutes or so to go over some audience questions. I noticed some questions about, what people should be doing right now, sort of from two ends. One end sort of being people that are currently at university, and then people that are sort of graduates are doing something else, a career changer. So maybe we can split it in both ways. In that, what can law students right now, whether law or non-law, could do during their studies, and then maybe someone, for example, that's working already, what could they be doing as well? To help them build up new experience if they have the opportunities.
Yeah, I'll start with that. A really good question. So for those of you that are still in school, I think one of the things you can start doing now is really trying to figure out your motivation for law and trying to research the different practice areas that are out there. Once you understand, you might not necessarily choose a specific area, like know exactly where you want to end up, but having some sort of rough idea can sort of guide where you then start to apply for, legal experience, whether that is, pro bono work, other types of volunteering roles. And then I would say, as Rebecca was mentioned earlier, it's very important to be well-rounded. So in addition to trying to secure legal experience, think about non-legal things that you're currently doing or you can actively do, whether that is getting involved in a society, um, taking on more responsibility at work if you have a part-time job, or even trying to volunteer outside of, law. So you might want to, if you're someone that is really passionate about literacy, for instance, you might volunteer at a bookshop or working with like young people. So again, all of these things should sort of help you develop those transferable skills that you can then start using in your application. So at this point, I think it's important to number one, understand your motivations for law, and then secondly, trying to map out where your experiences are at the moment and then where you want them to be. So look at the gaps in your skills and then start applying for legal and non-legal experiences that would match that. And then the second, did you say for those that are already working, or I can't remember the second
Yeah.
group of people? Okay. So if you're already working either in a legal role or non-legal role, I think what's key there is to, keep that skills audit or skill bank, making sure that as you're working, you're reflecting on what you're doing, challenges that you're facing, how you're overcoming those challenges, and you're able to flesh out different skills and different competencies from your work experience and having examples of when you've demonstrated them. So keep a log. So my 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 main advice would be to keep an achievement log or skills audit of your experiences so far. And then I would say, start researching these firms and start drafting your application answers. But bear in mind that, the earlier you start, the more likely you are to be successful in the sense that number one, you can seek feedback. So if you're working or you're at uni, you can, use your career service to get more feedback, and then refine your application further that way. That would be my main advice.
Rebecca, do you have anything to add? Or
Um, from my perspective as well, I'd just say, yeah, I mean, exactly what Comfort said. If you can get any additional experience, that's great. Like any types of volunteering experiences, diversity of experiences is great because you'll have a good bank to go off. So, for example, if you're at university, things like, yeah, when there's pro bono opportunities, when those kind of things are handed to you, the more you can do, the more you'll build up your skills, the more situations you'll have on default in interviews. That's really great. But obviously, yeah, sometimes you're working and things like that full time, it's not possible. But if you can just know in your mind what kind of skills you're building, how you're actively building them, maybe if there's opportunities at work to actively build them. So like we were talking today, what's the time that you made an improvement? You might find that there's opportunities for you to take slightly more initiative in your workplace. And something like that could be really good on a application for a law firm interview. But yeah, mainly what Comfort said, just had a good idea about what you're doing and what skills you're building, and have them kind of written down somewhere in a note so you can take them ahead with you.
thank you both. Yeah, and I think Rebecca, what you just said about looking at initiatives or things you could do more during your current work is very good because it links back to what you said about the goals, and being goal oriented. So if you do more, you'll be able to speak about more stuff, and have more options in the future. And then sort of on the other end, we have this question from Tim, which is, do you have any advice for career changes who cannot easily undertake legal work experience? For example, they said they can't devote, for example, 2 weeks to a vacation scheme.
Yeah, really. And it's one of the things that we see a lot in appointments. So here at BPP, we get a lot of career changes. I think the first thing you can do is to develop and improve on your networking. So you'll be surprised by how much networking can really help you, secure, get you the connection that you need to be in the workplace. So if you're not already using LinkedIn, start using LinkedIn, start connecting with law firms that you're interested in, and looking at the maybe like recent, trainees that work there or recent associates, and try and just find something that you like up on their profile, and that can be a conversation starter, and then go from there. I would also say if you're not able to directly do like, legal or apply for legal experience, then things like attending insight days and open days would also be valuable. And then ultimately try and see if there's a way that, you can. I'm just thinking in terms of how much time you have. I think it will still be useful to do some sort of volunteering experience, even if it's like, once a week or once a month that you've got availability. That would also be useful. But I think in the first instance, networking, and then secondly, I would say definitely book a consultation with your careers team on how you can translate your experience, the corporate experience that you might have, how can you reframe them in a way that is still valuable to and still applicable to law, and we can, have a conversation on how you can do that effectively. So definitely use your career service, if you have one. But yeah, the key thing for career changes, number one would be networking, and also trying to really explain what made them decide to have that transition to law. So one of the questions they would ask you is, oh, why law? Why now? So you really have to think about that reason and make sure that your answer to that is quite solid. And again, a careers consultant can guide you through that process.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And then sort of to wrap up with that one last one, Someone mentioned, retail work being quite common within people. So when it's time for applying for vacation schemes and training contracts, how does one stand out before others? Sort of when you have the same experience, maybe perhaps what do you bring in that would make you like a more unique candidate? To know if Rebecca or
Yeah.
Comfort, if either of you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I can start it off, and I'm sure Ricky will have loads to say as well. Yeah, I mean, it's similar to what we've been discussing. So again, having hobbies and having something else, and also thinking about, even though two candidates might have the same retail experience, their day-to-day actions and their contributions at work will be different. So what I, similar to what we've said previously about trying to take more initiative at work, trying to ask for more responsibilities, being more proactive, that would really help you stand out. I also think, again, with the hobbies, so anything outside of law, outside of the retail experience, whether that is, sports team that you support, whether that is I don't know, a hobby. For someone it might be, tutoring or some creative writing, whatever it might be, as long as you can explain why you do that activity and what you enjoy the most about it, that can help you stand out. And then I think as well, the connections that you have with the law firm. So if you're the candidate who has number one done the research, they're able to demonstrate commercial awareness. So it goes beyond the skills. It's about the commercial awareness as well. They've attended the insight days or the open days. You can have that personal connection to the law firm, which you can then evidence in your application. So those would be my main suggestions.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with all of that. I think hopefully there's one thing that's kind of been taken away today is it's not necessarily the experience itself, but it's the skills you learn and how you frame that. So as long as you can frame it in a way that shows that you're of value to the firm you're interviewing at, that you'll be an asset to them, I think that's the key skill. It doesn't matter if it's something that everyone's done, it's the specific action you took in that setting that makes you an asset. It's not the fact you're not going in there and saying, I've done retail work, hire me. You're saying, I've done retail work, this is the skill it taught me, and this is why I will be valuable to you because I've developed this. So I'd say don't worry about that kind of stuff. Like, don't worry about necessarily where you got it from. Just worry about what you learn and how it's relevant and how you can frame it. And I think you'll kind of be fine with whatever you do. And as Comfort said, if you have any other things that make you unique, everyone has a unique blend of interests and hobbies and experiences. And if you have, taken some initiative at work and done a particular thing, that will set you apart from other candidates. And if you can frame that well, you'll be fine. Would be my advice on that.
Thank you very much, Brett. That's very useful. And I think this is all we have time for, unfortunately. So if we didn't get to your question, I am sorry. But I think this is a good time to check in and see what everyone has taken out of the session. So if you could please answer the question on the screen, which is about your key takeaway. So what have you learned today? What's the main bit that you take after this session. And while I do that, I just wanted to say before you go, just another reminder to attendees that we'll be sending out a link containing the recorded session, so please keep an eye out for that. There'll also be a survey popping up on the masterclass after it's ended, so please fill that in to let us know how you enjoyed today and what other topics you would like us to cover in the future. And again, remember to also check out all our events that I mentioned earlier on the events page on lawcareers.net, including the upcoming boot camps and the next masterclass with BPP in March. And also do remember to post about this masterclass on LinkedIn so we can hear more about how you enjoyed it. Let's just look back at the poll. Okay. So we've got a decent mix between what you've taken. So a lot of you found it useful for identifying what skills transferable legal skills to show, how to structure examples for your application/interviews, and also what law firms look for in skill-based evidence. So thank you very much for that. I'll just share these results with the rest of you. And yeah, I just want to say thank you again to our great speakers today for the informative session. To everyone attending today, and we hope you enjoyed, and we do look forward to seeing you again next time. Thank you very much.